The body was already cold when Morag Thunderroar walked out of the foreman's tent with blood on her hands, and 15 men staring at her like she had put it there herself. She had not. Hendrik Voss, the overseer of the Gracebine Mountain logging camp, had been dead for perhaps 2 hours before anyone found him. The timber camp sat 3,000 feet above the valley floor, wedged between granite walls and the permanent shadow of the Gracebine Ridge, and it was the kind of place where men worked themselves to the bone and asked no questions about where the payroll money went. Hendrik Voss had been skimming that payroll for 11 months. Morag had been hired 6 weeks ago to guard the payroll chest because the camp's owner, a distant merchant in the valley town of Dunford, had finally noticed the discrepancies in his ledgers and wanted an outside set of eyes. None of that mattered now. What mattered was that Morag had found Voss dead, had pressed her palm to his throat hoping for a pulse, and had then stepped outside to report the death. And what the men of Gracebine Camp saw was a green-skinned orc woman with a dead man's blood on her hands coming out of a tent. "She killed him," said the first man to speak. "His name was Dort, and he was built like a barrel and twice as ugly." "I found him," Morag said. Her voice was steady, deep as mountain water, and she did not raise it even slightly. "Someone stabbed him from behind. You want to look at the wound instead of my face, you will see the angle was downward, meaning someone taller than me drove the blade in. I am not tall enough to have made that cut." "She is lying," Dort said. No one contradicted him. No one helped her either. That was the thing about being an orc woman alone in a human logging camp in the Gracebine Range. There was no middle ground. You were either trusted completely, which almost never happened, or you were the most convenient suspect in the room. Morag looked at the 15 men arranged in a half-circle around her. Some held axes, a few had hunting knives at their belts. None of them were drawing weapons yet, which meant there was still time to think. "I am going down the mountain," she said, "to Dunford, to find the man who hired me and tell him what happened. If any one of you wants to come and make sure I do not run, I welcome that. If any of you wants to try and stop me, consider carefully." She reached down and picked up the strap of her travel pack, which she had set beside the tent entrance, and she walked through the half-circle with a steadiness that made men step back without meaning to. No one stopped her, but Dort called after her. "You will not make it to Dunford before word does," he shouted. "Everyone in the valley will know what you did before you reach the crossroads." Morag did not answer. She pulled the hood of her vest up against the mountain wind and started down the switchback trail, and the cold settled over her like a second skin. The crossroads sat exactly where its name promised, at the junction of the Dunford Road, the Eastern Timber Trail, and the Northern Pass Road that wound up into the Gracebine Range. It was not a grand establishment. It was 2 stories of weathered river stone and dark timber, with a stables that smelled of horse and pine resin, and a common room that held perhaps 30 people before it became uncomfortable. Jacob Whitaker had inherited it from his father 6 years ago, when his father had died of a fever in winter and left him the inn, a debt to the mill, and a temperamental mule named Scratch. He was 28 now, lean in the way that men who never stop working tend to go lean, with brown hair that he kept cut short because he had no patience for it, and a face that was honest rather than handsome, the kind of face that made strangers feel, without quite knowing why, that they could tell him their troubles and not be laughed at. He was behind the bar when Morag walked through his door. He noticed her immediately, which was not difficult, since she was the only person in the common room who was not already a regular face. He noticed her outfit a half-second later, the way a person notices the details of something that catches their eye. Fitted warrior's leathers of dark reddish-brown, with tooled bracers at her wrists, and a vest that laced up the front over a sleeveless undershirt, and close-fitting riding trousers tucked into boots that came to the knee. The leathers fit her the way armor fits a person who has been wearing it for years, like a second layer of self. She was tall, even for an orc close to 6 feet, broad-shouldered, with the kind of build that came from actual combat training rather than manual labor. Her tusks were modest by orc standards, curving just slightly past her lower lip, and her eyes were a pale amber that caught the firelight from the hearth the way coins do. Her dark hair was pulled back in a rough braid that had half come undone, and she had blood on her right hand. She sat down at the bar without being invited, which happened all the time, and looked straight ahead at the shelf of bottles. "Ale," she said, "and water. And whoever here gives directions to Dunford without making me beg for them." Jacob poured the ale first, then the water, setting both in front of her. He did not ask about the blood. He had been running an inn at a remote mountain crossroads for 6 years, and he had learned the hard way that asking about blood before a person had a drink usually made things worse. She drank the water first, all of it in one long pull, and then wrapped both hands around the ale mug and sat very still. "Dunford is 6 miles east," he said, nodding down the road she had almost certainly come up. "You pass the signpost about a mile back. The road bends twice, and then you will see the river bridge." "Thank you," she said, not sarcastically, not perfunctorily, actually like she meant it. "You are coming down from Gracebine?" He asked because the Northern Pass Road was the only one that led up to the timber camps, and her boots had the particular gray dust of the high trail on them. She glanced at him. It was a measuring sort of look, not unfriendly exactly, but careful in the way a person is careful when they are deciding how much to say. "I am," she said. "Rough up there this time of year," he said. He started wiping down the bar, not because it needed it, but because he found that keeping his hands busy helped people relax. "The wind comes down off the ridge in the afternoons, and by evening it is brutal." She looked at him again, and this time the measuring quality in her eyes was slightly different. "You are not going to ask about the blood?" "No," he said. "Not my business until you make it my business." Something shifted in her expression. Not softened exactly, but something eased behind the amber eyes. "My name is Morag Thunderroar," she said. "I was hired as a payroll guard by a merchant in Dunford named Aldrich Coin. The camp overseer turned up dead this morning, and the men up there have decided I did it. I did not. I need to get to Coin before their version of events does, which may already be too late given that Dort Hagen has a horse and I have legs." Jacob set down the cloth. He had heard the name Aldrich Coin. Everyone at the crossroads had, because Coin's wagons went through twice monthly with payroll for the camp, and he was a hard-eyed man who paid his debts on time and treated his workers like equipment. "Dort Hagen," he repeated. "Big man, red beard, temper like a struck flint. That description fits. He came through here 2 hours ago on a gray horse, riding fast." Morag set down the ale mug with careful, deliberate care. "Then I am already behind." "You are," Jacob agreed. "Coin's house is on the eastern side of Dunford, near the river. Hagen would have reached him already if Hagen went straight there." She sat very still for a moment, and he could see her working through it, the logistics, the angles, the options available to someone in her position. He could see, too, that she was tired. Not just physically tired from the trail, but the kind of tired that came from spending energy on staying composed under pressure, from keeping your face still when men were looking at you like you were a danger to be managed. "Is there a faster road to Dunford?" she asked. "Not a road," he said. "There is a footpath through Briar Wood that cuts 2 miles off the trip. Locals know it, travelers don't." "Then I need a local," she said. She was not asking him. She was simply stating a fact and waiting to see what he did with it. Jacob untied his apron and hung it on the hook behind the bar. He called into the kitchen for his part-time helper Nessa to watch the front, received an affirmative shout in return, grabbed his coat from the peg by the door and said, "Come on then." Morag looked at him. "You are the innkeeper. I am aware of that. Why would you help me?" He thought about it honestly for a second because she deserved an honest answer. "Because you came in here and paid for your drink and told me the truth when you didn't have to. And because I can tell the difference between a person who is guilty and a person who is in trouble." She studied him for a moment with those amber eyes, and then she stood up and picked up her pack. "Lead," she said. The briar-wood path was narrow and dark under the canopy even in the afternoon, and Jacob set a pace that was fast enough to matter without being reckless. He was familiar with every root and hollow of that path from a decade of walking it. Morag kept up without effort, which did not surprise him, but the silence she kept was a different kind of silence than he expected. It was not hostile, it was attentive. She was watching everything around her, the bird movement, the wind in the high branches, the light angles, in a way that told him she had been trained to move through environments like this and had not forgotten how. "Have you done this work long?" he asked. "Payroll guarding." "For years," she said. "Before that, I was a fighter for hire in the Eastern campaigns. The border wars were ending, and I had a choice between looking for the next conflict or finding work that paid, without requiring me to decide every morning whether the cause was worth dying for. That seems like a reasonable distinction to make. Most people I have met do not see it that way," she said. "A mercenary orc is a frightening thing. A mercenary orc without a war to point her at is somehow worse." He thought about that. "The men at Gracebine hired you anyway." "Coin hired me," she corrected. "The men at Gracebine did not have a choice, and they made their feelings clear from the first day." She paused. "They were not entirely wrong to be wary from their own perspective. I was there to catch someone stealing from their payroll. That makes me an enemy regardless of what I look like. Voss was the one stealing, though, which is why someone killed him before I could bring proof to Coin," she said. "Someone who knew what I was looking for and decided it was cleaner to kill Voss and blame the orc than let the investigation run its course." Jacob let that land. It was a clean piece of reasoning, and it told him something about how her mind worked, methodically, without panic, even when the situation was designed to make panic seem like the only option. "Dort Hagen," he said. "Dort Hagen," she agreed. "He was Voss's cousin. I noticed that in the payroll records 3 weeks ago. I was building the case before I went to Coin. I needed enough proof that a human court would not simply dismiss it because an orc said so." There was no bitterness in her voice when she said it. Just a kind of flat, experienced realism that was somehow harder to hear than anger would have been. They came out of the tree line on the eastern edge of Briar Wood, and the road to Dunford was directly ahead of them, the river bridge visible in the middle distance, and the town's mill wheel turning slowly beyond it. They had cut 40 minutes off the trip. Aldrich Coin's house was a well-built 2-story stone building with a gate that stood open when they arrived, which was not a good sign. The gate being open meant someone had been in and out recently in a hurry. Jacob had been to the house twice before, delivering supplies that Coin had ordered through the inn, and he knew the housekeeper's face if not her name. The housekeeper answered the door with her mouth already set in a thin, unhappy line. "He is in his study," she said to Jacob, without looking at Morag at all. "There is already a man with him. He said no more visitors. Tell him Jacob Whitaker from the Crossroads Inn is here with Morag Thunderroar," Jacob said. "Tell him she found the body and needs to speak to him before he makes a decision about it." The housekeeper looked at him like he had asked her to handle a live coal. Then she went inside. They waited on the front step. Morag stood very straight and said nothing. Jacob stood beside her, just slightly forward, not in a way that was deliberate exactly, but in the way that the body moves when it is trying to put itself between something and a potential threat. Morag noticed. She did not say anything, but she noticed. The study had Dort Hagen in it, still in his riding coat, looking very comfortable in the chair across from Coin's desk. Coin himself was behind the desk, a narrow, sharp-faced man in his 50s with white at his temples, and the kind of hands that had once done hard work and now did the harder work of counting money. He looked up when they entered, and his eyes went to Morag's hands, which she had cleaned at the water pump in the yard before coming inside. "You have some nerve," Coin said to Morag. "I found him," Morag said. "I reported it. I came directly here to give you my account. If you want the truth, you will hear it. If you have already decided, then we are both wasting each other's time." Coin's eyes moved to Jacob. "You vouching for her?" "I am saying she came to me telling the same story she is telling you now," Jacob said. People who are lying about murders do not usually make a detour through the local inn to explain themselves. She ran, Dort said. He was watching Morag with a particular kind of hatred that Jacob recognized as personal, the kind that was not about what she had done but about what she was about to prove. I walked, Morag said, which you would know if you had actually tried to stop me instead of riding past me to get here first. That landed. Coin's eyes narrowed. She also told me that Dort Hagen is Hendrik Voss's cousin, Jacob said, which seems relevant. The room went quiet in a way that had weight to it. Coin sat back in his chair and looked at Dort for a long, still moment. Dort's face had gone through 3 expressions in 2 seconds, which is always the face of someone whose story has just developed a problem. That is a lie, Dort said. The birth records in Kelford Village would say differently, Morag said. I checked them because I check everything. Voss was skimming your payroll for 11 months, Master Coin. Hagen was the man he was paying part of it to. I have the ledger pages folded in my pack that show the discrepancies. Voss got nervous when I was hired and told Hagen I was getting close. Hagen killed him to close the investigation and arranged it so that the orc walking out of the tent with blood on her hands would take the blame. She reached into her pack and laid 3 folded pieces of paper on the desk. Coin unfolded them with the care of a man who does not let himself show emotion in professional settings. He read them. He read them again. Dort stood up. Jacob was between Dort and the door before Dort had taken 2 steps, not because he had planned it, but because the body moves on instinct in situations like that, and his instinct had always been to stand in the gap. Dort was 6 inches taller and 60 pounds heavier, and he stopped when Jacob did not move. I would sit down, Jacob said. You are an innkeeper, Dort said. Get out of my way. I'm an innkeeper who has been handling difficult guests for 6 years, Jacob said. Sit down. Coin had already reached across his desk and pulled the bell cord, and 2 of his household guards came through the back door with a speed that suggested they had been told to stay close. Dort looked at them, looked at Jacob, who was still in the doorway, and sat down with the face of a man calculating his next several moves. It took another hour of careful, tense conversation to lay out everything Morag had documented. By the end of it, Coin had sent for the town constable, and Dort Hagen was in custody pending a formal inquiry into Voss's death and the payroll fraud. It was not, as Coin was careful to explain, a full exoneration yet. These things took time. There would be hearings, but Morag was free to go, and he would continue to pay her contracted rate until the inquiry concluded. When they came out of Coin's gate into the late afternoon, the light was going orange and thin, and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees with the sun's angle. Morag stopped on the road and looked up at the sky for a moment, and something in her face changed. The composure held, but underneath it, in the set of her jaw and the slight forward tilt of her head, Jacob saw the shape of exhaustion that had been waiting behind the composure all day. That could have gone worse, she said. It could have gone much worse, he agreed. She looked at him then directly in that measuring way she had, and this time what was behind the measurement was something closer to warmth. You stepped in front of a man twice your size in a confined space without a weapon. I had the doorframe on my side, Jacob said. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the potential of one. You are strange for an innkeeper. You are the 2nd person this year to tell me that, he said. Come on, it is getting cold and I have a room at the inn. She paused. I can pay for my lodging. I know you can, he said. I am not offering charity. I am offering a room to a person who had a genuinely terrible day and who I would like to not see freeze to death on the road. She looked at him for another moment, and then she shouldered her pack and walked beside him, and that was the beginning of it. The Crossroads Inn in the evening was a different creature than it was in the afternoon. The common room filled with loggers coming down off the Gracebine access roads, a few merchants from the Eastern Trade Corridor, and the permanent fixtures of the local community who came for the fire and the company in roughly equal measure. Jacob worked the bar with the efficient, easy rhythm of someone who had done it so long that the work had become almost meditative, keeping track of who needed a refill and who had had enough, listening to 3 conversations at once and contributing to none of them. Morag sat at the bar again, in the same seat she had taken that afternoon, and ate the supper that Nessa brought from the kitchen with the focused, methodical attention of someone refueling rather than dining. She did not speak to the other patrons. The other patrons, in turn, did not speak to her, though there was a sustained quality of sideways glancing that Jacob noted and chose not to comment on. He set a second bowl of stew in front of her without being asked. She looked at it, then at him. "You looked like you were still hungry," he said. "I was," she said, and picked up the spoon. Around the second hour of the evening, a logger named Breck, who was not a bad man but was not a particularly thoughtful one either and who had had 3 ales, moved down the bar until he was 2 stools from Morag and said, "Heard there was trouble at Gracebine today. Heard an orc killed the overseer." Morag did not look up from her bowl. "Heard wrong," Jacob said. His voice was conversational. He was wiping the bar. "The overseer was killed by a man named Dort Hagen, who is currently in the custody of Constable Merrick in Dunford. The orc found the body, reported it, and spent the afternoon providing evidence that got the right man arrested. Would you like another ale, Breck?" Breck sat with that information for a moment, chewing on it. He was not, Jacob reckoned, actually hostile. He was just repeating what he had heard, which was the thing that turned rumors into mountains. "Well," Breck said. "That is different then," and he moved back to his original stool. Morag looked at Jacob again. "You do that a lot," she said. "Step in front of things." "I run a public house at a mountain crossroads," he said. "Half my job is stepping in front of things. The other half is stepping in front of things when you do not have the doorframe on your side," she said, and this time the smile was actual, brief and genuine, and it changed her face completely. It made her look younger, which was interesting, and warmer, which was not surprising but was very pleasant to see. He smiled back, and there was a moment between them that was quiet and warm, and that lingered a few seconds longer than it needed to. Then someone from the far end of the bar called for a refill, and Jacob went to provide it. Over the following days, the inquiry moved at the speed that official inquiries always move, which is to say, very slowly and with maximum inconvenience to everyone involved. Morag needed to remain in the area, available to provide testimony when called for, and the Crossroads Inn was the most practical place to do that. She negotiated a fair weekly rate with Jacob, which he charged her without ceremony, and settled into the room at the end of the upstairs hall. She was not, it turned out, a person who stayed in her room. She was up before dawn every morning, which Jacob knew because he was up before dawn every morning, and he would come down to start the kitchen fire and find her already in the stables, grooming Scratch the mule with the patient, repetitive care that the mule did not particularly deserve. She helped Nessa with the morning bread without being asked, on the second day, because she had walked through the kitchen and noticed that Nessa was behind. She fixed a hinge on the storeroom door that had been sticking for a month, using tools from the stable's workshop, and said nothing about it until Jacob noticed and asked. "It was sticking," she said. "I had time." She was not trying to earn her place. She was simply a person who could not remain idle when there was work visible, which was something Jacob understood completely, because he was exactly the same. In the evenings, after the supper rush, she would sit at the end of the bar with a cup of hot tea. She did not drink heavily, which was a detail he noted without making anything of it, and he would lean on the counter from the other side and they would talk. Not about the inquiry or the trouble at Gracebine, not usually. About other things. About the mountains, which she knew from years of moving through them, and which he knew from a lifetime of sitting at their feet. About the Eastern campaigns that she had served in, and the particular strange loneliness of fighting in a cause that you were not fully certain you believed in. About what it meant to stay in a place, to put down roots, which was something she had not done and which he had done so thoroughly that the roots had become the shape of his life. "You could have sold the inn when your father died," she said one evening. "Gone somewhere." "Gone where?" he asked. Anywhere, somewhere different. This is what I know, he said. The road, the mountains, the regulars. I thought about leaving once early on. Thought maybe there was something else I was supposed to be doing. He turned his cup in his hands. But people come through here on their way somewhere else, and for a few hours they are not travelers, they are just people sitting in a warm room. That is worth something. That is worth staying for. She looked at him steadily, and the warmth in her eyes was not the brief kind that flickers and goes. It was the slow kind, the kind that builds. You are not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Someone suspicious, she said. Someone who kept his distance. That is the usual response. The usual response is usually about fear, he said. I am not afraid of you, Morag. She was quiet for a moment. You should be just a little, she said. It would be the sensible thing. You fixed my storeroom hinge, he said. It is hard to be sensibly afraid of someone who fixes your storeroom hinge. She laughed then, a real one, low and warm, and it was the best sound the common room had produced in months. The second week of her stay, the weather turned. It had been coming for days, the particular gray quality of the light, the way the high peaks disappeared behind cloud, the drop in temperature that made the inn's stone walls hold the cold even when the hearth was burning high. By the third morning of the second week, snow was coming down the Grayspine Range like a curtain being drawn, and the temperature at the crossroads had dropped to the kind of cold that had edges. Jacob was splitting wood in the yard when he heard the horse, a rider coming fast down the Northern Pass Road, which in this weather was either an emergency or very bad judgment. Jacob set down the axe and stood watching as the horse came through the gate and the rider pulled up sharply, half falling from the saddle. It was one of Coin's household guards, a young man named Terrace who had been at the meeting in the study. They are moving Hagen today, Terrace said, breathing hard. He had ridden without a proper coat and his teeth were beginning to chatter, transferring him to the regional court in Ashford, but there are men from Grayspine who know the transfer route. Word got back to the camp that Hagen killed Voss, and there are men up there who want their back wages that Voss stole, and they know the transfer party is small. It could go badly. Jacob understood immediately. They are going to ambush the transfer. Not to free Hagen, Terrace said. They want the proof, the ledger pages. They think if they can get the evidence, they can bargain for their wages directly with Coin, instead of going through a court process that might take a year. That is foolish, Jacob said. That is desperate, Terrace said. But Master Coin says it will destroy the case against Hagen if the evidence chain is broken. He sent me to find Morag. She is the one who put the ledger records together. If there is anyone who can talk those men down, it is her. Morag had appeared in the stable doorway. She had heard. She was already pulling on her bracers. Jacob looked at the sky, at the snow coming down, at the road that wound up into the Grayspine Range, where the wind off the ridge could push a grown man off his feet in the wrong spot. He went inside and got his coat. The transfer route went up the main switchback road for 2 miles before cutting east along the Ridge Shelf Road that eventually connected to the Ashford Regional Highway. In good weather it was a half-day's ride. In the current conditions, with the temperature dropping and the snow thickening, it was a different proposition entirely. Morag knew the route. She knew, too, which of the men from Grayspine would likely lead a move like this. Terrace had named 3 of them, and she recognized 2 as men who were not violent by nature but were cornered, underpaid, and frightened about the coming winter. That changed how you dealt with them. They moved fast, pushing through the snow on the main trail while Terrace went ahead to warn the transfer party. The wind off the ridge had started in earnest by the time they reached the first switchback, cutting horizontal and finding every gap in their clothing with the efficient malice of mountain weather. Jacob was not complaining. He was not going to complain, but the cold was serious and getting more so, and at the second switchback he said, simply and practically, the ridge shelf is going to be exposed. The wind will be worse up there. Yes, Morag said. She had not slowed, just noting it. I know the cold, she said. I know my limits. He believed her. He also watched her shoulders as they climbed and noticed, without making a thing of it, that she was controlling her breathing very deliberately, the way you do when your body is reminding you how cold it is, and you are reminding your body who is in charge. They came up over the last switchback and onto the ridge shelf road, and the wind hit like a flat hand. It was the kind of cold that stole the breath from your mouth before you could use it. The shelf was 40 feet wide at most, cut into the rock face with the mountain wall on their left and a drop on their right that fell away into gray nothing. The snow was driving sideways, and the light had gone from gray to white gray, the peculiar flattening that happened in mountain snowstorms when depth disappeared and everything became the same pale lack of shadow. Jacob pulled his coat tighter and put his head down and pushed forward. He had the hood up in his hands in his pockets because gloves were something he had not grabbed in the hurry. Morag had no hood. She had her warrior's leathers, which were good leather and cut close, but they were not winter gear. They were not made for this. She had dressed for a Gracebine autumn, which was cold but manageable, not for a ridge shelf in a driving mountain snowstorm. She was, he saw when he glanced over, shaking. Not dramatically. She was controlling it, the way she controlled everything, the shaking mostly visible in her jaw and in the slight involuntary hunching of her shoulders. She was keeping the shaking out of her hands through sheer will, which was impressive and also exactly the kind of thing that people do when they would rather suffer than appear to need help. Jacob did not say anything about the shaking. He did not ask if she was cold or suggest she stop or offer sympathy. He simply stopped walking for a half-second, shrugged his coat off his shoulders, and stepped behind her to settle it around them. She tensed immediately. "I do not need." He did not argue. He did not respond at all, actually, just let the coat settle and then stepped back to her side and kept walking, and the silence he kept was perfectly comfortable, completely unpressured, a silence that said, "It is done. It is not a statement about anything. Let us keep moving." She walked beside him with his coat around her and did not say another word about it. But after 30 seconds, she pulled the coat closer at the front with one hand, just slightly, and that was its own kind of answer. They found the transfer party at the narrow point where the shelf road bent around a rock outcropping, 3 of Coin's guards with Hagen in wrist irons on horseback, and 6 men from Gracebine spread across the road with axes and the specific body language of people who are committed to something they are not entirely sure about. Morag stepped forward and Jacob stayed at her shoulder. "Bren Halker," she said, addressing the man at the front of the Gracebine group. She knew him. He was a faller, a good one, with a family in the valley. "I know what you are owed. I know Voss took 14 months of your back rate and put it in his own pocket. I know the court process feels too slow and too uncertain." Bren looked at her. He was cold too, all of them were, and the cold was making everyone's options feel simpler and sharper than they probably were. "You want us to trust a court," he said. "Courts do not work for men like us." "This one will," Morag said, "because I am the evidence, not those ledger pages, not Coin's word, me. I spent 6 weeks building this case and I will not stop now. I will stand in front of every tribunal in the Ashford district and tell them exactly what Voss took and exactly where it came from, and I will do it until every man on this road gets what he is owed. But I need Hagen to reach that court intact. Stop this transfer, the case breaks and Hagen walks free and none of you see a copper." Bren was quiet for a long moment. Snow drove between them. Jacob kept very still. "And if the court fails," Bren said, "then I come back," Morag said. "On my own word as a hired sword, I will make it right personally. You have my oath." That landed differently than a legal promise. An orc's oath was not a casual thing. The Gracebine men knew that, even if they did not know much else about orc customs. Bren looked at the other 5 men. He looked back at Morag, and then, just briefly, at Jacob, who was standing at her shoulder in his shirt sleeves in the middle of a mountain blizzard. "Who is this?" Bren said. "Jacob Whitaker," Jacob said. "Crossroads Inn. I vouch for what she just said." "You are just an innkeeper," Bren said. "Yes," Jacob said, "which means I will still be at that crossroads when all of this is settled and you can come to me if it is not. That is what vouching means." Bren considered that for another moment. Then he stepped aside. The transfer party moved through. The Gracespine men watched them go. Nobody threw anything or drew a blade. In the cold silence of the ridge shelf road, with the snow filling in their footprints behind them, Morag and Jacob stood until the transfer party was around the bend, and the Gracespine men had begun the walk back down the switchbacks. Then Morag turned and looked at Jacob, and he was genuinely shaking now, having been out of his coat for the better part of 20 minutes on a ridge in a blizzard. She unsettled the coat from her own shoulders and put it back around his with exactly the same matter-of-fact silence that he had used when he had put it on her, and then she said, completely without ceremony, "Let us go down." He pulled the coat on and they went down. By the time they reached the crossroads inn, the storm had settled in properly, and the road had become a suggestion rather than a fact. Jacob built the fire in the common room to a height that made the room feel small and warm and orange, and Nessa brought tea and the kind of substantial food that mountain weather required. Morag sat at the hearth rather than the bar, her boots off, her feet toward the fire, and Jacob sat in the other chair with his coat still damp from the mountain. "You have been an innkeeper for 6 years," she said. It was not a question. "Yes. Before that, I helped my father run it," he said. "Before that I went to school in Dunford for 2 years. Before that I grew up here. You have never left." "I went to Dunford," he offered. "That does not count." He smiled at his tea. "No, it probably does not." She was looking at the fire. "I have never stayed anywhere longer than a season," she said. "Even when I was young, even before the campaigns. There is a thing in orc culture, a word I cannot translate well. It is something like the pull of the next horizon, the feeling that whatever is valuable is somewhere you have not been yet. I was always the one who felt that most. And now," she did not answer immediately. She turned her cup in her hands the same way he had turned his that first night. "Now," she said and paused and then left it there, unfinished in the warm space between them. He did not push it. He understood instinctively that some things needed the space to finish themselves. 3 days later, Dort Hagen's men came to the inn. There were 4 of them, not men from Gracespine but men who had been hired. Jacob could see that from the way they moved, hired muscle rather than angry workers. They arrived at midday, while the common room was not yet full, and they did not order food or drink. They stood just inside the door, and the one who was their clear leader, a heavy man with a scar across his chin, looked around the room until his eyes landed on Morag. "Hagen wants the ledger pages back," Scarchin said, "before the Ashford hearing. He says bring them in the next 2 days or things at this crossroads get complicated." Jacob was behind the bar. He had a heavy wooden mallet he used for tapping barrels. He set it on the bar top with a sound that was audible in the quiet room. "The ledger pages are with coin and have been since the day Morag brought them to Dunford," he said. "So either Hagen's information is wrong or this visit is about something other than ledger pages." Scarchin looked at the mallet. He looked at Jacob, who was, in any honest assessment, not a physically imposing person. He was a lean innkeeper in a working apron. And then he looked at Morag, who had turned on her stool slowly and was now facing them with the relaxed, completely still quality of someone who has been in situations like this a great many times and has never once lost. "We are not leaving without something," Scarchin said. "Then you are going to have a long stay," Morag said. "Because the ledger pages are not here, I am not afraid of you, and I will not be intimidated on someone else's behalf to save a man who killed his cousin and tried to have me hanged for it." Scarchin moved toward her. Jacob came around the end of the bar. He was not going to win a fight against 4 hired men, and he knew it, but he had been raised to believe that the value of a stand was not always in whether you could win it. He moved to put himself between the advancing man and Morag, which was, in retrospect, both the kindest and most unnecessary thing he had done that week, because Morag was already moving. She was off the stool and past him in a single fluid motion, and what happened next was brief and decisive and slightly hard to follow at the normal speed of events. Scarchin went down. The second man went into a table. The third backed into the doorframe. The fourth, who had been outside and had looked in at the noise, simply walked away. It was over in perhaps 15 seconds. Scarchin was sitting on Jacob's floor with his hand over his nose, looking at Morag with an expression that had moved directly from threat to a thorough reconsideration of the afternoon's plans. "Leave," Morag said. "Tell Hagen that his intimidation already failed twice, and the third attempt will not go better. Tell him also that the hearing is in 4 days, and there is nothing he can do about it now." They left. Morag straightened her vest, which had barely shifted, and looked at Jacob, who was standing at the end of the bar with his arms folded and an expression on his face that she could not quite categorize. "You stepped in front of that man again," she said. "You were going to try and take him." "I was going to try," he agreed. "I would not have done well, admittedly." "No," she said, "you would not have." And then, before the words could land with any sting, she crossed the room toward him with a directness that made the 2 remaining customers in the common room develop sudden and pressing interests in their own cups. She stopped very close. Close enough that the amber of her eyes was the whole of what he was looking at. "Why do you do that?" she asked. It was not an accusation. It was something older and more careful than an accusation. "Because you matter more to me than the odds do," he said. And he said it simply, without drama, the way you say a thing that you have already settled in yourself before the moment arrives. She looked at him for a long moment in that quiet way she had, the one that felt like being read rather than simply seen. Then she put one hand against his jaw, and the touch was careful and deliberate, the kind of touch that is its own kind of statement, and she said, "You are going to make this very difficult for me." "What thing?" he asked. "Leaving," she said. He covered her hand with his and held it there. "I was rather hoping you would not." The first time she kissed him it was like the rest of her, direct, certain, uncomplicated by hesitation. It was the evening of the following day, after the supper rush, when the common room had gone quiet and Nessa had gone home, and the fire was burning down to a comfortable amber. He was washing the last of the mugs, and she came and stood beside him at the basin, and without preamble she turned his face toward hers with one hand and kissed him, and it tasted like the tea they had both been drinking and the warmth of the fire, and something that had no useful name, but that felt very much like the end of something lonely. He put his hands on her waist and kissed her back with everything he had, which was considerable, because he had been quietly wanting to kiss her for approximately 10 days, and the wanting had built to a very fine point. They stood in the warm, fire-lit kitchen of the Crossroads Inn and kissed until they both needed to breathe, and then she put her forehead against his, and they stayed like that for a while, just breathing. "I have orc customs I should probably explain to you," she said. "I would like to hear them," he said. "Orcs do not court slowly," she said. "When we choose, we choose. The word in my language for it means something like, I have decided the horizon I want is this one." He pulled back just enough to see her face. The amber eyes were warm and direct, and holding a kind of vulnerability that she wore carefully, like something she was still learning to put down. "Is that a statement?" he asked. "An inquiry?" "Both," she said, "depending on your answer." "My answer," he said, "is that I have been at this crossroads for 6 years, and nothing going by on the road ever made me want to go with it, until a woman sat down at my bar with blood on her hand and paid for her drink and told me the truth." She smiled, and it was the full, unheld version of it, the one he had been catching glimpses of for weeks, and it was extraordinary. "Then I have decided," she said. "So have I," he said. The Ashford hearing took place 11 days after Morag had come down from Gracespine Mountain. It was a formal proceeding in the regional court hall, a stone building with high windows and the particular cold dignity of official places, and it lasted the better part of 2 days. Morag gave her testimony with the same clean, methodical precision she applied to everything, walking the tribunal through the payroll discrepancies, the family connection between Voss and Hagen, the physical evidence of Voss's wound, and the sequence of events on the day of the death. Jacob sat in the gallery and watched. He had not been called as a witness. He was there simply because she had not asked him not to be, and because when he had told her that morning that he intended to be there, she had looked at him for a moment and then said, "Good," in a voice that was quiet and meant quite a lot by the single syllable. Hagen's lawyer tried 3 different angles to discredit her testimony. The first was that she had been alone with the body. The second was that her contracted status as a payroll guard gave her an interest in blaming someone other than herself. The third, delivered with the particular delicacy of someone who knew it was a bad argument but was going to try it anyway, was that her account of the blood evidence was the account of a person accustomed to killing and therefore more familiar with what murder looked like than an innocent person would be. It was the third one that made Jacob's hands tighten on the bench in front of him. Morag answered it without flinching. She said, "The tribunal can inspect the wound. The angle is factual. I am not asking them to take my word for anything that can be verified by a physician's examination. If the tribunal would like to verify my account of the physical evidence independently, I welcome that." The tribunal did verify it. The physician's report matched her account precisely. On the afternoon of the second day, Dort Hagen was found culpable for the murder of Hendrik Voss and the payroll fraud, and was remanded to the regional prison at Ashford. Coin's remaining payroll debt to the Grayspine workers was acknowledged in writing and would be paid within 30 days. When Morag walked out of the court hall into the thin autumn sunlight, Jacob was waiting on the steps. She stopped beside him and looked up at the sky for a moment. "It is over," she said. "It is," he agreed. "My contract with Coin technically concluded this morning," she said. "He paid me the full rate and released me from obligation." She paused. "I have no reason to stay at the crossroads anymore." "No professional reason," he said. "No," she agreed. "No professional reason." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the road that led back toward the mountains, and the expression on her face was the one she had worn that first evening at the bar complex, and layered and containing things she was working through in real time. "Morag," he said. She looked at him. "Come home," he said. She was quiet for a moment that felt very long and was probably 5 seconds. Then she said, "That word is going to take some getting used to." "I have time," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a long exhale. Then she reached over and took his hand, not tentatively, not experimentally, but with the same certainty she applied to everything, and they walked down the steps together. They rode back to the crossroads in Coin's spare wagon, which he had provided for the trip given the weather. The mountain light was going flat and cold by the time they reached the crossroads, and Jacob could see from half a mile off that the inn had more horses at the post than usual, which meant it was a busy evening, which meant there was work waiting. He helped Morag down from the wagon, and she held his hand a second longer than necessary before letting go, and then she said, "I will start the fire if Nessa hasn't," and went inside. He stood at the crossroads for a moment in the fading light, the inn behind him, the 3 roads going off in their 3 directions, the mountains in the north with snow on them now down to the tree line. He had stood in this exact spot 10,000 times. He had never before felt like the spot was exactly right. He went inside. The busy evening turned out to be busy in the particular way that came before news traveled, because the Dunford contingent that passed through the inn most evenings had heard about the Ashford verdict from a courier on the road and had opinions about it. The opinions were mixed in the way that opinions always were in places where humans and orcs had a complicated history. Some thought justice had been done, some were uncertain about the evidence, and a smaller number felt, without fully articulating it, that there was something unsettling about an orc mercenary being the person who had cleaned up a human camp's corruption. Jacob listened to all of it without saying anything until a man named Foster, who ran the eastern toll gate, and who Jacob had never particularly liked, said loudly from his corner table, "All I am saying is that Coin should have hired a proper investigator. Sending an orc into that camp was looking for trouble from the start." Jacob stopped wiping the bar. Sending a qualified professional who found the evidence and held her ground under considerable pressure is what Coyne did, he said, which is why the man who committed the actual crime is in Ashford prison tonight. What would a proper investigator have done differently, Foster? Foster shifted in his seat. You meant that it bothers you, Jacob said, which is your business. But this inn is also my business, and in it I ask that you keep the things that bother you to things that are actually wrong rather than things that are merely unfamiliar. The room was quiet. Morag was at the far end of the bar, facing forward, completely still in that way she had. Foster did not say anything else. The evening moved on. The fire crackled. The ale went round and the conversations found their new levels, and by the second hour most of the tension had settled into the ordinary comfortable noise of a full common room. Morag waited until Jacob was near her end of the bar and then she said quietly, "You did not have to do that." "Foster says something like that every 2 weeks, Jacob said. "Usually about the merchants from the Eastern Trade Corridor. I was overdue for it." "It was not the same thing," she said. "No," he admitted. "It was not." He leaned on the bar. "But the answer to it was the same. People say things like that because nobody corrects them. I can correct them in my own establishment without the world ending." She looked at him steadily. "In the Eastern campaigns," she said, "I fought alongside human soldiers for 3 seasons. Not one of them ever stepped in front of anything for me. Not a slur, not a bad order, not anything." She paused. "I told myself it did not matter, that I did not need that. That I was strong enough to handle it alone." "You are strong enough to handle it alone," he said. "Yes," she said, "but it is different when someone does it anyway." He reached across the bar and covered her hand briefly with his, and she turned her palm up and held his for a moment. Someone at the other end of the bar needed a refill and he went to provide it. But when he came back she was still at her stool and she was, he thought, as close to home as she had been anywhere in a long time, and that was a thing worth protecting. The days settled into a rhythm. Not the static rhythm of before, when the inn ran itself in the way that a machine runs itself with enough maintenance, but a different kind, fuller, more inhabited. Morag had not officially discussed what her staying meant in terms of labor or arrangement, but she had started doing things. Managing the storeroom inventory with the same systematic precision she had applied to the payroll ledgers, evaluating the stability of the upstairs floor boards, and identifying 3 that needed replacing, starting conversations with the Dunford stable master about the supply chain for horse feed in winter. She did these things without announcement, the way she had fixed the hinge, and Jacob watched and understood and said nothing about it because some things were better understood than discussed prematurely. He asked her about 2 weeks into this new rhythm what she wanted the arrangement to be. They were in the storeroom at the time, taking stock of the winter provisions, and she was writing numbers in the ledger with a practicality that he found enormously appealing. "What do you mean?" she said. "I mean, what do you want this to be? The staying, the work. What arrangement suits you?" She put down the pen and looked at him. "What would you like it to be?" "I asked first," he said. She was quiet for a moment in a way that was not evasive but thoughtful. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to be useful and I want to be here. I do not want a wage arrangement that makes this feel like employment." Rather than she stopped. "Rather than what?" he asked gently. "Rather than something that is mine," she said. "Us, this place, all of it." She met his eyes. "I have not had a thing that was mine in a very long time." He crossed the storeroom in 2 steps and put both arms around her, and she pressed her face against his neck, and they stayed like that for a long moment in the dim, quiet storeroom that smelled of dried herbs and barrel wood. "It is yours," he said. "It has been yours since you fixed the hinge." She laughed against his neck, and he felt the shape of it through the whole of her. The winter came down from the Grayspine Range and settled over the crossroads like a great quiet hand, and the inn became a different kind of place, a shelter as much as a waypoint, somewhere people dug in for the duration rather than passing through. The common room was full most evenings. Morag was there for most of them, running the floor with an efficiency, and a presence that people had gotten used to faster than Jacob had expected. Even Foster, who came in twice a week out of habit, had stopped making pronouncements and occasionally nodded to her when he came in the door, which was, in the currency of Foster's social gestures, practically a declaration of warm regard. There was a night in deep winter, when the snow had been falling for 3 days straight and the crossroads were properly buried, and the inn was full of people who were not going anywhere. When Morag came and found Jacob in the kitchen after the supper hour and stood in the doorway and looked at him with the expression he had come to know as the one that meant she was about to say something she had been building toward, he turned the last of the bread in the oven and set the paddle down and waited. In Orc custom, she said, when a warrior decides to lay down the road they mark it. It is not a ceremony exactly, it is an act. Something done in front of people that says, "This is where I stopped traveling and this is what I am traveling toward." She paused. "I would like to do that here with you, if you are willing." He understood that this was the largest thing she had said to him and that the carefulness with which she was saying it reflected how large it felt from the inside. "Tell me what it involves," he said. She told him. It was simple. She would announce her intention publicly in a room of people, and then she would offer him a choosing gift, something made by her hands, and if he accepted it, they were bound. No officials required, no written instrument. Just the words and the gift, and the acceptance witnessed. "What is the gift?" he asked. "I will make it," she said. "You will not know it until I give it." "And then what?" he said. "And then," she said, "the horizon I have decided on is this one, you permanently." He went to her, and she let him put both hands on her face, and he looked at her with everything he had, all the years of this place and all the loneliness that had sat in him quietly the whole time and all the months since she had walked through his door, and he said, "Yes, whenever you are ready." She chose the following Saturday, when the inn was full. Jacob had not told anyone what was coming, partly because it was not his to announce, and partly because the element of witness needed to be genuine rather than arranged. Morag had been in the workshop behind the stables for 3 evenings, working on something she would not let him see. She emerged on Saturday evening when the common room was at its fullest, with the snow still coming down outside and the fire burning high and all the usual faces at their usual tables, and she walked to the center of the room. The conversation went quiet in that organic way that quiet spreads when a person with physical presence makes a deliberate move. "I was not born here," she said. "I am not from this valley or these mountains. I came to this crossroads 6 weeks ago chasing a problem that was not entirely my doing and found." She paused and looked at Jacob behind the bar more than I was looking for. Jacob was very still. "In my people's custom, when a warrior lays down the road, they say so, publicly, without softening it or making it small." She reached into her vest and took out a small object, a bracelet of braided cord, leather and black wire twisted together with a flat stone set at the clasp, polished to show the grain. She had made it in those 3 evenings in the workshop. "Jacob Whitaker," she said. "You stepped in front of things that were not your problem. You did not ask me to explain my blood or my history before you gave me what I needed. You vouched for me in front of courts and camps and cold mountains and did it with nothing to gain but the satisfaction of doing what was right. You have made a place that feels like mine." She crossed the room to the bar, and people moved out of her way without appearing to think about it. She held out the bracelet. "I have decided the horizon I want is this one. You are what I am traveling toward. Will you accept that?" The common room was very quiet. Jacob came around the bar. He looked at the bracelet in her hand, then at her face, at the amber eyes that were direct and vulnerable and certain all at once. "I will," he said, and held out his wrist. She fastened the bracelet around it. Then she put both hands on his face and kissed him in front of 30 people, and the common room of the Crossroads Inn erupted in the specific kind of noise that happens when something that has been building for a while finally arrives. Breck, who had been there since the beginning, was the first to pound the table. Foster, who was in his corner with his ale, waited about 4 seconds and then raised his cup in a gesture that was as close to grace as he was constitutionally capable of. Nessa burst into tears and blamed the onions, of which there were none nearby. Jacob and Morag stood in the middle of the common room with his hands on her waist and her hands on his jaw and the fire burning high behind them. And the crossroads was exactly as it had always been: 3 roads, 3 directions, the mountain to the north and the valley to the east and the wide, uncertain world going off to the west, but none of those roads felt empty anymore. The spring arrived with the abruptness that mountain springs tend to produce, as if the cold had simply run out of patience one morning and the world had moved on without ceremony. The snow retreated up the grayspine faces, and the mud roads turned back to solid ones, and the crossroads found its full traffic again, the merchants and travelers and workers and wanderers who made up the seasonal pulse of the place. With the spring came Bren Halker and 4 other men from Grayspine. They arrived on a Thursday morning when the common room was quiet, and Morag was out back working with the horses. Jacob saw them come through the gate and watched their posture upright, not aggressive, the walk of men with something to deliver rather than something to take, and met them at the door. "We want to see Morag Thunderroar," Bren said. He was carrying something wrapped in rough cloth. Jacob called for her. She came from the stable yard with a brush still in her hand, saw the men, and went still for a moment before she walked toward them. "The back wages came through," Bren said without preamble. "Every man on the Grayspine roster. Coin paid it out last month, full amount plus the interest the court ordered. 14 of those men asked me to bring you this." He held out the wrapped object. She took it and unwrapped it, and inside was a length of worked timber carved with considerable skill, a relief of a ridge line that was unmistakably the Grayspine Shelf Road, and along the top of it a single orc woman's figure, and beside her a smaller figure, and the carving was detailed enough that you could see the coat around the smaller figure's shoulders. "Who carved this?" Morag asked. "Dort's cousin Yance," Bren said. "He is the one who was most certain you did it." He wanted to correct that himself. Morag looked at the carving for a long moment. "Come inside," she said, "all of you. I will not let you travel back up to Grayspine without a meal in you." They came inside, and Jacob put food on the table, and for 2 hours the Crossroads Inn held a gathering that was unlike most of the gatherings it had held, quieter, more deliberate, the kind of conversation where people who have been on opposite sides of something work their way back to a common ground, carefully and without rushing it. Before Bren left, he shook Jacob's hand and said, "You are a strange innkeeper." "People keep saying that," Jacob said. "It is a compliment," Bren said. Morag hung the carving above the bar. It was still there the following summer, when the Ashford Tribunal published its final finding on the Hagen case, fully exonerating Morag of any connection to Voss's death, a formal legal document that Coin sent by courier with a letter acknowledging her service. Jacob read the document at the bar and handed it to her, and she read it once and set it down and said, "Good." In the same single-syllable way, she said most important things. Then she poured 2 cups of tea and set one in front of him. "I want to expand the storeroom," she said. "The winter showed me we are losing space badly. I sketched a design. Do you want to look at it?" He looked at the tribunal document, and then at the carving above the bar, and then at her, with her tea and her sketch and her absolute pragmatic focus on what came next. "Yes," he said. "Show me." She spread the sketch on the bar, and they bent over it together, heads close, and the morning light came through the window, and the road outside was already busy with the day's first travelers, and it was, Jacob thought, an extraordinarily good life. There was a Saturday in late summer when Dunford held its harvest gathering, as it did every year, at the wide square by the river bridge. It was the largest community event in the valley, 3 days of trading and music, and the particular kind of sociability that people who had been working through the mountain seasons were hungry for by the end of summer. Jacob had always attended, running a small tapped barrel that he brought down in the cart as a goodwill gesture from the inn. He had always attended alone. This year he brought Morag. She sat beside him on the cart's bench with the natural ease of a person who had stopped calculating whether she belonged in any given place and had decided simply to be in it. She wore her warrior's leathers, dark reddish-brown and well-maintained, her bracers polished, her hair in its usual braid that had started neat and would be somewhat less so by midday. She looked exactly as she always looked, which was formidable and present and more beautiful than anyone who primarily associated those qualities with threat was going to expect. The square was full when they arrived. Several people looked. Some of the looks were the sideways kind. Some were more direct. Jacob brought the cart to a stop at the usual spot near the mill side of the square and jumped down and offered Morag his hand from the bench, which she took not because she needed the assistance, but because she knew what it meant and chose to let it mean that. They set up the barrel together, and people came and got their cups, and some of them spoke to Jacob and looked past Morag, and some spoke to both of them, and a few, including Breck, who had walked down from the crossroads, and two of the men from Gracebine who had come to the inn in spring, greeted Morag specifically and with the warmth of people who had been on a road with someone and had not forgotten it. By the afternoon, when the music had started at the far end of the square, the Dunford constable, a different man from Merrick, younger, with an open face, came to introduce himself. "I have heard a great deal about you both," he said. "The Crossroads Inn, yes. And you are the investigator from the Hagen case." "Former investigator," Morag said. "Current innkeeper." "The valley could use more of either," the constable said, and shook her hand as if that were the most ordinary thing in the world, which for him apparently it was. There was a moment later in the afternoon, standing at the edge of the square with the river going by and the late summer light hitting the water and the music carrying across from the far side, and people moving in the easy, unhurried way they moved when they had stopped working and started living for 3 days, when Morag looked at Jacob with the amber eyes that he had been reading for most of a year now and said, "This is the horizon." "Yes," he said. He was not surprised by it. He had felt it too. "I think I understand now," she said, "why you stayed." He laced his fingers through hers and looked out at the valley, the mountains above it, the road that went north toward Gracebine and east toward Ashford and west toward all the places they had not been and might someday go together. "You could still go somewhere," he said. "I would go with you if you wanted." She looked at him. "Would you really?" "I would close the inn and go," he said, "if that was what you needed." She turned to face him fully, and she put one hand on his chest over the bracelet he wore on his wrist, and she said, "I do not need the horizon any more. I need this." She pressed her palm flat. "You, here, this place that is ours." He put his hand over hers. The music played. The river moved. The people of the valley went about their harvest gathering all around them, and not everyone who had looked sideways was looking sideways anymore. And not every conversation had turned to warm welcome, because that was not how the world worked. It turned slowly, and some stones never turned at all, but enough of it had shifted that the square felt like a place that belonged to both of them. "Then we stay," he said. "Then we stay," she agreed. They stood there in the late summer square of Dunford, with the whole of the valley laid out around them, and the Crossroads Inn was a few miles north on the mountain road, and the fire would need banking by evening, and Nessa had probably already started the supper, and the autumn would come soon and bring the loggers back down from Gracebine and the merchants in from the east, and there was a storeroom expansion half finished behind the stable yard, and none of that was small, and all of it was theirs. When they drove back up the mountain road in the cart as the sun went down, the light was orange and long, and the Gracebine peaks caught it and held it like embers. Morag sat beside him with her shoulder against his, and the mule Scratch plodded at his usual pace, which was not fast but was reliable, and the inn appeared in the bend of the road looking exactly as it had always looked, weathered stone and dark timber, the stable to the right, the light already in the common room windows where Nessa had lit the evening fire. It looked like home. It looked like hers. Morag jumped down from the cart before it stopped fully, which was something she did with the practiced ease of a person who had been getting on and off moving things her entire life. And she looked up at the inn with her hands on her hips, and the amber eyes going from the ground floor to the upper story and back, the same way she had looked at it that first morning she had stayed, when he had come down to start the kitchen fire and found her already in the stables. He pulled the cart into the yard and unhitched Scratch and led the mule into his stall, and by the time he came out, she had already gone inside to help Nessa with the supper. He stood in the yard for a moment in the last of the light, the mountain road quiet behind him and the inn alive in front of him, and the bracelet on his wrist was warm from the day's sun. He went inside. The common room was filling up with the usual Thursday evening faces, and Morag was behind the bar, something that had simply happened at some point without formal designation, and she looked up when he came through the door, and the look on her face was the full smile version, the unheld one, and she said, "I saved you supper. It is in the kitchen. Eat before you start on the evening." He went to the bar and kissed her cheek and said, "5 minutes," and she swatted his hand away from the bread she was cutting with an affectionate efficiency that made Breck, sitting 3 stools down, look very interested in his ale. The carving was above the bar where she had hung it, the ridge line, the 2 figures, the coat around the smaller one's shoulders. The tribunal letter was folded behind it, tucked into the frame. The bracelet was on his wrist. The storeroom plans were tacked to the workshop wall. The mule was stabled. The fire was burning. And the woman who feared nothing in the world had decided, against all odds and in the company of an ordinary innkeeper at a mountain crossroads, that this was the horizon worth traveling toward. Jacob Whitaker went to the kitchen and ate his supper and then came back out and worked the evening with the woman he loved. And the crossroads inn stood as it had always stood at the junction of 3 roads, a warm light in the mountain dark. And now, when travelers came in off the trail in the cold and sat down at the bar, they were served by 2 people who knew exactly what it meant to come in from the cold and find something worth staying for. The road ran north to Gracebine and south to Dunford and east to Ashford and west to all the wide world, and none of those roads were calling any more. This was the place. This was enough. This was everything.